A human has just challenged the great I am as if they were equals. Here in chapter 5, Pharaoh asks, "Who is Yahweh that I should serve him?" Well, Yahweh is going to respond here in 7 through 15 by saying, "Let me introduce myself with 10 strikes against the land of Egypt, the first 9 of which have an amazing literary design. 3 triads, which have matching elements both horizontally, 1, 4, and 7, and vertically as well." This is incredible. Take a look at the design of these first 9 plagues. So we notice here in plagues 1, 2, and 3, each of them, the magicians attempt to replicate the plague or replicate the sign. It works out for them in the first 2, though I don't know why they would want more frogs in the land of Egypt. Doesn't work out for them in the third. But magicians are active in plagues 1, 2, and 3. And then look at horizontally as well. Plagues 1, 4, and 7 each begin in the morning. There's this phrase, only occurs in these plague narratives, and then each of them ends with a purpose statement, "So that you will know, O Pharaoh, that I am Yahweh." Look at the next horizontal strip here, 2, 5, and 7. Each of these take place in Pharaoh's palace. Isn't that interesting? Now, the first kind of horizontal strip takes place by the Nile. This takes place in Pharaoh's own house. That's where Moses goes to meet with Pharaoh. And then this last group of 3, this last triad, 3, 6, and 9, there's no location specified. And this is interesting, there's no warning given to Pharaoh. So the typical narrative sequence in this section is Moses will march into Pharaoh and he'll say, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh will say, "No, why would I do that?" And Moses will give a warning, "If you don't, this is what's going to happen." And then Pharaoh says, "Oh, get out of my house." Well, we have no back and forth sequence like that in plagues 3, 6, and 9. No warning at all. The plagues just happen. So this incredible design with these series of triads. Now, again, these plagues, they are acts of judgment and they are acts of revelation. Yahweh's self-revelation. This is who I am. Witness my power displayed before the watching world. In this way, through Yahweh's exercising of his strong hand and his mighty arm, he is making a name for himself. His name is Yahweh. There's a critical statement in chapter 9 to that effect. Take a look at chapter 9, verse 15. This is the seventh plague. Interesting that it's number 7. Where he says that I will send all of my plagues on you, which is kind of interesting. Perhaps it has like a summary type element to it, so that you will know that there's none like me in all the earth. For by now, hey, I could have stretched out my hand against you and your people and cut you off. I could have ended your resistance just like that. But instead, I decided to prolong this contest between the two of us for this purpose. This is why I raised you up, and this is why we're having this conversation, Mr. Pharaoh, so that I can show my power and so that my name, the name of Yahweh, will be proclaimed through all the earth. Now, hundreds of years later, Israel, the nation of Israel, will point back to this event, to the Exodus, as the defining moment in their relationship with Yahweh and the defining moment of the name of Yahweh itself. Look at this little chart about the meaning, a collection of verses about the meaning of the name Yahweh, where Yahweh made a name for himself. We just read here in Exodus 9:16, I am displaying my power so that my name will be proclaimed. Well, hundreds of years in the future, Nehemiah would say in chapter 9, this is his prayer, where he says that you, Yahweh, made a name for yourself when you performed signs and wonders in Egypt, when you delivered your people through the Red Sea and led them in a pillar of cloud and fire through the wilderness. That is how you made a name for yourself, a name that has persisted to this day. Isaiah says something very similar in chapter 63 of that book, where he references the Red Sea deliverance and Yahweh leading them through the wilderness And he says that these acts were done so that you would make for yourself an everlasting and a glorious name, Yahweh. That is how your name was cemented in stone. Well, that name, the name of Yahweh, would forever, thanks to this Exodus event, be associated with the liberation of all creation from the power of the snake. And here in chapter 7 through 15, it is time to crush a snake. The snake-like Pharaoh and the spiritual powers, the dark spiritual powers, which are empowering his campaign of violence and subjugation. Well, just before the 10th plague, there's this curious statement about the gods of Egypt. Take a look at chapter 12, verse 12. We're talking about again, another purpose of the plagues. For this is the Lord's Passover. I will pass through the land of Egypt, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land. And look at this, on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. There are, in some sense, gods of Egypt, spiritual powers, demons, and Yahweh is going to execute judgment on them there in Egypt. Now, scholars for a long time have noted possible connections between the 10 plagues and the gods of Egypt, their deities, their pantheon. And here's just one example. This is a chart put together by John Walton of some of the connections possibly between the plagues and the Egyptian gods. So, of course, there are several gods, Egyptian gods, which guarded the Nile River, their sacred waters. And, of course, they were powerless to prevent those waters from turning to blood and then subsequently killing all the fish in the Nile. A few different gods took the form of a frog and others of a cow. And of course, the land of Egypt is going to be filled with dead frogs and dead cows. That's kind of an insult, isn't it? And then, of course, one of the most famous Egyptian gods is the god of the sun, Ra. And he was powerless to prevent his land from turning dark. So, in these 10 plagues, God is upending the whole Egyptian pantheon, and he is upending the very order and stability of the land of Egypt itself. And that is possibly why there are 10 plagues. Why not 7 plagues? 7's a great number. Well, there's 10, possibly because just like in creation, in Genesis chapter 1, there are 10 speech acts in which God creates all things. He does it on 6 days, but if you count the number of times where it says, and God said, you'll come up to a total of 10. God created the world in 10 acts, and now he is decreating the land of Egypt in 10 acts of decreation, in which the paradise land of Egypt is descending into chaos. And it seems like this is what the author intends us to infer from these plagues, because many of the same words which are present in Genesis 1 and 2, specific key words, are present in this plague account as well. Take a look at just a handful of these word-level connections between the creation account in Genesis 1 to 3 and the decreation of Egypt in Exodus 7 to 11. Let's just look at a couple of them here. So on day 3 of creation, God gathers together the waters into one place so that the land can appear. Well, with the first plague, Moses stretches out his staff over the waters of Egypt, the Nile, and all of their pools. And this is the same word for gathering place. It's a gathering place of water, kind of a rare, unique word being used in both instances. Well, on, let's see, this would probably be day 4 of creation. God causes the waters to swarm with living creatures, just as the Nile swarmed with frogs, and those frogs came jumping out and pestered all of the Egyptians. Well, God forms the man from the dust of the ground, and then he commands that man to fill the earth. Well, Moses is going to strike the dust of the earth, and that dust is going to become gnats, and those gnats, and then later the flies, are going to fill the land of Egypt. And what's curious is that this phrase "dust of the earth" is this symbol in the Bible. It's an image for death. So here we have the dust of the earth in the form of gnats covering on top of man and beast. So it's like the Egyptians are covered with death. That's quite an image there. And take a look at this one. This is kind of interesting. So the word for boil in Hebrew is the word for serpent spelled backwards. Serpent is nahash, boil is shahin. And the Hebrew authors, the biblical authors, will play these kind of word games pretty often, switching letters around. It's a really interesting way of creating these literary connections. And then finally, with the ninth plague, let's just look at a final example. The Hebrew in this statement here, where it says that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, it can be translated, the words can be equally translated, "Let there be darkness over the land of Egypt," which of course is like a backwards reflection on what God said on day one, "Let there be light." Let there be darkness on the land of Egypt and on Pharaoh. But the thing is, I mean, honestly, is it even his fault? Is it Pharaoh's fault that all these plagues came on his land? Doesn't the Bible itself say that God hardened his heart? Pharaoh had no choice but to invite this death upon his kingdom, didn't he? Well, a surface level reading of the text may produce this conclusion, but a deeper reading would result in a more nuanced explanation of statements like this. So yes, of course, God certainly did harden Pharaoh's heart here in the book of Exodus. Let's just confirm that. No one's going to deny the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. But the thing is, Pharaoh, he hardened his own heart as well. Look at this. Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also. And then there's this kind of more neutral statement, which doesn't say who hardened his heart, but it simply just says the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. So we have God hardening Pharaoh's heart. We have Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And then we just have this neutral statement as well. And if we take all of these hardened statements and we overlay them on top of the plagues, we discover something rather interesting. Take a look at this chart, which brings together every instance of this hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And this first section is the hardening that takes place before the plagues, or at least that is anticipated to take place before the plagues, and then the hardening during the plagues themselves, and then hardening after the plagues. We'll take a look at this. Statements about Yahweh hardening the heart of Pharaoh, I have those highlighted in blue, and you'll notice that the first 5 plagues, it's either Pharaoh hardening his own heart or just this neutral, his heart was hardened. It is only after the midway point, it is only after the first 5 plagues, at plague number 6, that God is going to directly intervene and begin to harden Pharaoh's heart himself. Now, when he does this, this is not Yahweh causing Pharaoh to act in opposition to his own will. Of course it isn't, because Pharaoh has already hardened his heart himself. No, what Yahweh is doing when he's hardening the heart of Pharaoh is simply strengthening Pharaoh's own will, his own resolution. Because at this point, we see that Pharaoh has reached a point of no return. To use New Testament language, he's committed blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And subsequently, after this point, God is going to use Pharaoh in order to display his glory and to make a name for himself with these signs and these wonders. The last of which, number 10, plague number 10, is the death of the firstborn in Egypt, which of course is a direct response to what Pharaoh did here in chapter 1, in which he took Israel's firstborn sons, and now God is going to demand Egypt's firstborn sons. However, God is going to provide something that Pharaoh never did. God is going to provide a way of escape for Israelites and for Egyptians as well. If they were to have faith and to listen to the voice of Yahweh, they can escape this judgment of the death of the firstborn. You see, the entire land of Egypt is being given over to death, but Yahweh is going to preserve a remnant from this flood of decreation by providing both a refuge and a substitute. Now that language should sound a little bit familiar, a little bit like the Noah's flood account in Genesis 6 through 9, and it's kind of curious. So you remember how the angel of death would pass over the houses of the Israelites when they would put the blood on the door. Well, the word house, this refuge for the Israelites living in Goshen, that is the word ark spelled backwards. Isn't that interesting? Well, this the houses, the refuges of the Israelites would be spared because of the blood of a substitute on their door, on the door and on the mantle. Now, this image of a door in the Bible, the Old Testament specifically, is a marker between life and death. And it's a place where sacrifices are offered. So Cain and Abel, they offered a sacrifice, didn't they, in Genesis chapter 4? Well, that sacrifice was offered there at the door of Eden, it seems most likely. Noah, after he got off of the boat, off of the ark, he's going to offer a sacrifice at the door of the ark, which is kind of that floating sacred space on the waters. And then both the tabernacle and the temple, the altar of burnt sacrifice is placed there in front of the door of the holy place. And that is to teach us that holy place, God's own presence, is accessible for us through the blood of a substitute. Well, anyways, this entire gripping narrative, all of the plagues, one after another, boom, 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 is going to be interrupted by two boring chapters of Leviticus-like law, ritual law for how the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are to be practiced. What's that all about? Take a look at this two-chapter Leviticus-like interruption on this gripping narrative here in Exodus, where we have chapters 7 through 11 are the 10 plagues, but then we have law, and then we have narrative again, and law, narrative again. And these laws are first communicated to Moses from God, and then Moses communicates the content of those laws about celebrating Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and consecrating one's firstborns and then redeeming the firstborns. Moses communicates that to the people. Well, why do we have these law sections, this Torah, interrupting our narrative at this point? Well, it's as if the entire narrative of God's redeeming of his people is going to come to a culmination by addressing future readers. Because these laws are how those future readers would participate in the acts of God's exodus of his people. This event and these events are not to be locked in the past, but they are to define your own life in the present and in the future, and they are to define your very calendar. Israel's calendar is to be defined by these events. So let me show you what I mean. Israel's calendar, what's that about? Well, the Feast of Passover, let's take a look at chapter 12, verse 11. The Lord's Passover and the feast which follows this, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is to be celebrated in the month of Abib. That's the month. That's the Hebrew month, the month of Abib. And the beginning of this section, chapter 12, tells us that this month, Abib, shall be for you the beginning of months. The month of Abib will be the first month of the year for you. It wasn't in the past, but now I'm telling you, January 1 is Abib for you. It is the first month on your calendar. And in so doing, what we're communicating is that the Exodus, it's going to mark the beginning of Israel's calendar and of its life. It's another in the beginning statement. It's an action of new creation, the creation of the nation. This is not the only connection to Genesis 1 in these final chapters of Israel's redemption from the land of Egypt. Uh, you see, in Genesis chapter 1, on day 2, God is going to separate the waters. And now we're going to jump to the Red Sea section here. Moses is going to raise his staff and separate the waters of the Red Sea, revealing dry land or dry ground, just like God did on day 3 of creation. So we have these connections with Genesis chapter 1 happening again. And then in Exodus 14, this dry ground is going to appear after there was this wind that blew over the sea all night long. And the word for wind in Hebrew is ruach, which is the same word as spirit, which is perhaps a nod to Genesis 1 verse 2, which says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters there before creation. And of course, all this serves to reinforce a point that we already made, that Israel's liberation from Egypt is for them an act of new creation, the creation of the nation of Israel. So that's chapter 14. Chapter 15 is a poetic retelling of the same event. So we did it in narrative. Now we're going to do it in poetry. And take a look at how this poetry uses all of this literary language and metaphors to kind of heighten what was described already in narrative. So that same wind that we described a minute ago, it's going to be described here in 15 verse 8 as the blast of Yahweh's nostrils. That's what caused the Red Sea to open. When he blew with his wind, Yahweh personally acting to save his people. And then he's going to personally throw horse and rider into the sea. He's going to cast them into the sea. And then Miriam later is going to sing about Yahweh's victory, saying the horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. But notice also, this is critically important, the future orientation of this song. It's really quite interesting. So verses 1 to 12, this is talking about Yahweh's victory over Egypt in the past, or what he's just accomplished over Pharaoh's chariots. But then we transition here in verse 13 to Yahweh's future victory over the land of Canaan. The inhabitants of Philistia, Edom, Moab, Canaan. We haven't interacted with any of these guys yet, but they are melting in fear and dismay because they've heard about what Yahweh is capable of. And then there's this amazing reference in the last 2 lines here of the poem to Jerusalem itself, the dwelling place of God, his mountain, the sanctuary of Yahweh. And then just to make one more connection to Noah's story there in Genesis 6 to 9, in the same way that Noah's ark is going to traverse through the chaos waters, and it's going to land on a mountain, and Noah's going to jump out of the ark, and he's going to build an altar. He's going to meet with God and plant a garden there. In the same way, Israel is going to pass through the wilderness, and they're going to come to a mountain garden where they will be planted, and they will meet with God, and that God will reign over his people. I mean, this is an amazing prophecy of what's going to happen to Israel in the future. And it's here in Exodus chapter 15, all the way back in Exodus 15, where Yahweh is prophesied to reign over his people Israel as their king whose name is Yahweh. And this poem tells us for another time the meaning of that name, Yahweh. And what is Yahweh? The Lord Yahweh, he is a man of war. The Lord Yahweh is his name. He will fight for his people. Now, you'd think, after all of this, these 10 plagues, deliverance through the Red Sea, you'd think Israel would get it. I mean, who wouldn't want to serve a God like this, who is so powerful and so committed to keeping his good promises for them? And yet, chapters 16 through 18 are going to tell us that there is something fundamentally flawed with God's covenant partners. And we're going to turn to these anticlimactic stories next.